Spring came early that year, and with it, the scent of new beginnings. The fields behind the house turned green again, the lilacs bloomed by the porch, and the mornings grew warmer. Amelia woke each day to the sound of birds instead of traffic, and the peace that once felt foreign now felt like home. She had started painting for the local art fair, a project her father encouraged even though he never said it outright. He would leave fresh coffee by her workspace every morning, pretending it was nothing, but she always smiled when she found it. Life moved slowly but beautifully. She and Noah saw each other often. He had become a quiet part of her days, sometimes helping her father fix things around the house, sometimes sitting with her while she painted. Their connection deepened without words. It wasn't a story of sudden passion or wild romance. It was gentle, steady like the tide. It felt like something real, something that could last. One Sunday morning, Amelia found her father sitting on the porch reading an old newspaper. The sunlight touched his gray hair, and for a moment she saw the years that had passed written softly across his face. "You're up early?" she said, handing him his coffee. "Old habits," he replied with a small smile. Then he looked at her for a long moment and said, "You seem different lately." "Different good or different bad?" She teased. "Good," he said simply. "Like you finally stopped fighting the world." She laughed lightly but felt her throat tighten. "Maybe I just stopped fighting myself." He nodded as if that was all he wanted to hear. For a while they sat in silence, watching the morning mist lift from the hills. Then he said something that stayed with her. "When I told you to stand still, I didn't mean stay. I meant don't let fear make your choices. Life doesn't move in straight lines, but you'll miss everything if you keep running from what's right in front of you." Those words landed deep in her heart. She didn't say much in reply, just leaned her head on his shoulder like she used to when she was a child. The air was soft and quiet, filled with the sound of distant wind chimes. She realized how much she had missed moments like this, moments that asked for nothing but presence. Later that afternoon, she met Noah by the harbor. The sky was clear, the water calm. They walked along the dock, passing fishermen and children feeding gulls. Everything felt alive. Noah carried a small wooden box he had made for her, a simple gift, smooth and beautiful. Inside, he had carved a small compass and the words, "Find your way, but don't forget where you started." Amelia's eyes softened as she traced the letters with her thumb. "You made this?" He nodded, a little shy. "Thought it might remind you that home isn't always a place. Sometimes it's a person. Or a feeling." She looked up at him, emotion rising in her chest. "You've always known how to say things that matter," she whispered. He smiled. "You just needed time to hear them." They stood quietly, watching the sunlight shimmer over the water. For a moment, neither moved. Then Noah reached for her hand and she let him. It wasn't a grand moment or a confession. It was something simpler. Two people finding peace in each other's company after years of searching for it elsewhere. Days turned into weeks. Amelia's art began to take new form, brighter, fuller of life. Her father started visiting her studio, pretending to give advice but mostly watching proudly. He told her stories about her mother, how she used to paint in the same light-filled room before the world got too busy. Amelia felt her mother's presence there, in the smell of turpentine, in the soft brush strokes, in the laughter that filled the space again. One evening, as the sun dipped low, she brought her father one of her finished paintings, a portrait of the old porch, with him sitting there under the morning light. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then, in a voice rough with emotion, he said, "You captured more than how it looks. You captured how it feels." That night, he told her something he'd never said before. "When your mother died, I thought the world had stopped. But then you were there, this tiny little person who didn't understand loss, who laughed even when I couldn't. You saved me without knowing it. And when you left, I understood. You needed to find your own way. I just hoped one day you'd remember that you could always come home." Amelia felt tears well in her eyes. She took his hand and held it tightly. "I'm home now, Dad," she said softly. He smiled faintly. "Yeah, I can see that." The next morning, the sky was golden and the sea breeze carried the scent of salt and flowers. Amelia went for a walk down the trail behind the house. When she reached the cliffs, Noah was already there, sketching in his notebook. He turned when he saw her and grinned. "Didn't expect you this early," he said. "I couldn't sleep," she replied, walking closer. "I've been thinking about everything. Good thoughts, I hope?" She smiled, a little sad, a little certain. I think so. My father reminded me that fear shouldn't make my choices. I think that's what I've been doing. Living afraid to stay, afraid to love, afraid to lose. Noah closed his notebook. You're not afraid now? She looked out at the horizon, where the sun met the water. Not anymore. I think I finally know what I want. He waited, patient as always. She turned to him and said, I want to build something real. Not perfect. Not rushed. Just honest. Noah stepped closer, the wind catching his hair. Then let's start there, he said softly. Amelia nodded. No grand promises, no dramatic declarations, just a shared truth between two people who had finally stopped running. They stood there together, watching the sunlight rise higher, their hands brushing lightly. That evening, as the day faded into soft gold, Amelia returned home. Her father was sitting on the porch again, watching the horizon. She sat beside him quietly, and after a long silence, she whispered, When you told me to stand still, I didn't understand. But now I do. You weren't asking me to stay here. You were teaching me how to be present wherever I am. Her father looked at her, his eyes warm and full of pride. You found your balance, kiddo, he said softly. That's all I ever wanted for you. Amelia smiled, resting her head against his shoulder as the sun dipped below the hills. When you spoke those words, my life shifted forever, she whispered, and it was true. Not because his words changed her path, but because they helped her see it clearly for the first time. Love, she realized, wasn't something to chase or escape. It was something to nurture, quietly, faithfully, in the place where your heart finally stands still. As night fell and the stars appeared, Amelia closed her eyes. The porch creaked beneath her, the air was cool, and for the first time in years, everything felt exactly right. She was home, not just in a house or a town, or even beside the people she loved, but within herself. And in that stillness, her story truly began. The days that followed were calm, but full of quiet change. Amelia woke earlier, helped her father with chores, and began painting again in the small sunroom that smelled of pine and dust. The canvas felt strange under her hands after so many years, but the colors came naturally, like an old language she hadn't forgotten. Her father would peek in sometimes, saying nothing, only smiling as if proud that she was finding her rhythm again. Noah stopped by often, sometimes to bring tools, sometimes groceries, sometimes for no reason at all. Amelia never asked why, and he never offered an explanation. They'd sit on the porch or walk by the harbor, talking about simple things, music, local festivals, the weather. But underneath every word was something unspoken. A pull neither of them dared to name. One afternoon, the sky turned gray and rain began to fall in steady sheets. Amelia had gone to the old bridge near the river to take photos for a painting idea. The rain caught her off guard, and by the time she reached the oak tree for shelter, she was drenched. A familiar voice called out from behind her. You still forget to check the weather, huh? She turned to see Noah holding a jacket over his head, smiling through the rain. She laughed, shaking her head. Some habits never change. He joined her under the tree, both dripping wet, both laughing at the absurdity of it. The moment felt like something out of their youth, carefree, honest, untouched by time. When the laughter faded, silence filled the space between them. Not uncomfortable, but heavy with everything they didn't say. Amelia looked at him, her voice soft. You ever think about what would have happened if I hadn't left? He met her eyes. Sometimes. But then I think maybe you had to go, so you could find your way back. His words hit deep. She looked away, her throat tight. I lost myself somewhere along the way, she admitted. I thought I was chasing happiness, but I think I was just running from fear. Noah didn't speak for a moment. Then he said quietly, maybe love isn't supposed to save us. Maybe it's supposed to remind us who we are. The simplicity of it broke her. Tears welled up, mixed with rain, and she didn't bother to hide them. He didn't move closer, didn't try to comfort her. He just stood beside her, the rain falling around them like a curtain of forgiveness. When she went home that evening, her father was waiting on the porch, sipping coffee. He looked at her soaked hair and red eyes, but said nothing. He just smiled slightly and said, You look lighter. Amelia sat beside him, still dripping rainwater onto the steps. Maybe I am, she said. He nodded and leaned back, watching the clouds drift apart. Sometimes it takes coming home to remember who you were before the world told you who to be. The next few weeks passed gently. Amelia painted more, laughed more, and started visiting the town market with her father on weekends. People who hadn't seen her in years stopped to talk, surprised at how much she'd grown yet still calling her Tom's little girl. She didn't mind. For once, being known didn't feel like a burden. Noah became part of those days without either of them planning it. He helped her fix the broken steps, taught her how to use an old camera, and sometimes just sat beside her in silence. He was patient, never asking for more than she could give. There were moments, when their hands brushed or when their eyes met too long, that carried a quiet spark, but both let it rest there, in the space between friendship and something deeper. One evening, her father called her into the living room. He was holding an old box filled with letters and photos. "Your mother used to keep these," he said, handing it to her. "Maybe you'll find something in there worth remembering." Amelia opened the box later that night. There were love letters between her parents, written when they were young, full of hope and tenderness. She read one where her mother had written, "Love isn't a destination, it's the road we walk when we choose each other every day." Tears filled Amelia's eyes. For so long she had seen love as a grand moment, something that had to sweep her away to mean something. But maybe love was smaller, quieter. Maybe it was showing up, staying, listening, and trying again even when it hurt. The next morning, she went to Noah's workshop. He was sanding a wooden chair, his sleeves rolled up, sawdust on his arms. She stood in the doorway for a long time before saying, "You ever get tired of fixing things?" He smiled. "No, some things are worth the effort." She stepped closer, her heart racing. What if it's not broken? What if it's just lost? Noah looked at her then. Really looked at her, like he was trying to read everything she wasn't saying. "Then you help it find its way home," he said quietly. Something in her shifted at that moment. It wasn't fireworks or a sudden rush. It was a deep, quiet recognition, a knowing that she was exactly where she needed to be. Later that day, they drove to the cliffs overlooking the ocean. The sun was setting, and the sky was streaked with gold and pink. The sound of waves crashing below filled the silence. Amelia closed her eyes, letting the wind brush against her skin. She said softly, "I used to think happiness was out there, somewhere far away. But maybe it's been here all along." Noah didn't answer. He just reached over and took her hand, not asking, not forcing, just holding it, steady and warm. She didn't pull away. When she got home, her father was asleep in his chair, a book open on his lap. She covered him with a blanket and stood there watching him for a moment. This house, this life she had once been desperate to escape, now felt like the place she could finally breathe. That night, she sat by the window, painting the ocean under the sunset. For the first time, her brush didn't hesitate. The lines were confident, free. The painting wasn't about what she saw. It was about what she finally understood. Stillness wasn't the absence of movement. It was peace after the storm. The next morning, her father found her painting drying by the window. He smiled and said, "Your mother would have loved that." Amelia smiled back. "I think she would have liked Noah too." Her father chuckled softly. "Then maybe you should stop making him wait on the porch." She laughed, shaking her head, but she knew he was right. She wasn't sure where her story with Noah would go, and for once, she didn't need to know. What mattered was that she wasn't running anymore. She was standing still, heart open, ready to let life unfold at its own pace. As the morning light filled the room, Amelia realized something profound. She hadn't come home to escape her past. She had come home to remember who she was before she forgot how to love, herself, her roots, and the simple beauty of belonging. And somewhere in that stillness, her heart began to remember how to love again. The next morning, Amelia woke up to the smell of pancakes and coffee. Her father was already in the kitchen, humming an old tune. He didn't ask how she slept, but the way he pushed a plate toward her said enough. It was his quiet way of saying, "I'm glad you're here." After breakfast, she decided to walk to town. The air was cool and clear, and the sound of birds reminded her of how still life could be when you weren't rushing through it. The small coastal town hadn't changed much. The same bookstore sat on the corner, the same diner still had a flickering neon sign, and the same harbor stretched out beyond the trees. It felt like stepping back into a memory she'd locked away years ago. She was halfway to the coffee shop when her phone buzzed. The name on the screen stopped her in her tracks, Noah Carter. Her heart gave a small, startled jump. Noah had been her best friend growing up, the boy next door who taught her how to ride a bike, who fixed her first car, who made her laugh until her stomach hurt. But somewhere between high school graduation and her move to New York, they'd drifted apart. She hadn't thought about him in years, or at least she told herself she hadn't. His message was short. Heard you're back in town. Thought I'd say hi. She stared at the words for a long moment, unsure how to respond. Finally, she typed back, "Hi, Noah. Yeah, just for a while." His reply came almost instantly. "Coffee at the Harbor Cafe? Like old times?" When she walked into the cafe that afternoon, her pulse quickened. He was already there, sitting by the window, sunlight catching in his hair. He stood when he saw her, his familiar smile making her chest ache in a way she didn't expect. He looked different, older, more grounded, but his eyes still carried that same warmth she remembered. 5 years, he said as she sat down. "Didn't think you'd come back." "Didn't think I would either," she said, trying to sound casual, though her voice trembled slightly. They talked for hours. At first, it was small things, mutual friends, changes in town, her life in New York, but soon the conversation shifted, becoming deeper, more personal. Noah told her he'd stayed in town after college, taken over his uncle's construction business, and built a quiet life by the coast. He never married, never left. "Guess I like knowing where I belong," he said, smiling faintly. His words echoed her father's from the night before, and it unsettled her. Amelia told him about her life too, the art shows, the city lights, the rush that once thrilled her but eventually drained her. She didn't mention Daniel's name at first, but when she finally did, Noah didn't flinch. He just listened. His silence wasn't empty. It was understanding. That was what she had always liked about him. He never tried to fix things. He just made space for them to be felt. When they finally left the cafe, the sun was setting, painting the sky gold. They walked by the harbor and the air smelled of salt and pine. For a moment, everything felt easy, almost familiar. "You haven't changed much," he said softly. "Still chasing the horizon." "Maybe," she said, glancing at the waves. "But I think the horizon caught me this time." They stood in silence, watching the light fade. There was no need to fill the space. The years between them seemed to melt away. That night, as Amelia lay in bed, she thought about Noah's calm voice, his steady presence. He was everything her life in New York hadn't been, simple, honest, unhurried. But part of her was afraid. She had already built and lost one future. She wasn't sure she could bear to start another. Over the next few days, she saw Noah more often. Sometimes at the cafe, sometimes when he passed by her father's house to drop off groceries or tools. He always had a reason to stop by, but their conversations lingered long after the excuses ended. One afternoon, he showed up with a box of old letters and photos. "Found these in my attic," he said with a grin. "You might want them back." Inside were snapshots of their teenage years, summer fairs, camping trips, late nights under the stars. There was one photo of the two of them sitting on the hood of his old truck, laughing about something neither could remember. As she looked at it, she felt a lump rise in her throat. "We were just kids," she whispered. "Yeah," Noah said softly. "But I remember thinking even then, you were going to change everything." Amelia met his eyes. For a second, the world felt still again. She wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. He smiled faintly, as if he understood, and changed the subject. That evening, she joined her father on the porch. The sky was overcast, and thunder rumbled in the distance. "You saw Noah today," he said. Not as a question, but as a quiet observation. She nodded. "He's doing well." "Still the same." Thomas looked at her for a long moment. "Some people never leave because they already found what they were looking for." She didn't answer. Instead, she watched the rain start to fall, slow and steady. She thought about how Noah looked at her, not with longing, but with something gentler, acceptance. It scared her how safe that felt. The next morning, Noah stopped by to help fix the garden fence. Her father had mentioned it needed repair, and Noah had offered before she could. They worked side by side, their hands brushing occasionally, their laughter echoing between the trees. There was no rush, no pretending. It was as if time had given them a second chance to exist in the same space again. As they packed up the tools, Noah turned to her. "You know," he said, wiping his hands, "you don't always have to start over." Sometimes you can just start from where you are. His words hit her harder than she expected. For years, she had believed happiness lived somewhere far away, in another city, another person, another dream. But maybe it had been waiting right here all along, in the quiet rhythm of a town she once couldn't wait to leave. That night, Amelia couldn't sleep. She lay awake listening to the rain against her window. She thought of her father's wisdom, of Noah's steady voice, of how both men, different as they were, seemed to see something in her that she had missed in herself. She walked outside and stood on the porch barefoot, the air cool and damp. The world felt softer somehow, like it was finally slowing down to match her heartbeat. For the first time, she didn't feel like she was running from something or towards something. She was just here, and maybe that was enough. Somewhere deep down, she knew her life was shifting again, not with chaos this time, but with calm. And she couldn't help but wonder if that was what her father had meant all along. The rain eased into a mist. In the distance, she could see a faint light from Noah's porch glowing through the fog. She smiled, wrapped her arms around herself, and whispered into the quiet, "Maybe this is where I begin to find myself again." She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a long time, she was ready to find out. Amelia drove through the winding Oregon roads as dusk settled, her car filled with the faint scent of coffee and worn-out perfume. The radio played softly, but her thoughts drowned out the music. It had been 5 years since she left home, and everything about her return felt heavier than the luggage in her back seat. The world outside was quiet, but inside her, a storm hadn't stopped for months. Her father's house stood just as she remembered, small, gray, and surrounded by pine trees that whispered with the wind. She parked and sat for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, unsure if she was ready to face him. But she had nowhere else to go. Her father, Thomas, opened the door before she could knock. He looked older now. His once dark hair was silver, his shoulders slightly bent, but his eyes were the same, calm, watchful, steady. He didn't ask questions. He simply said, "You're home," and stepped aside. The smell of pine soap and black coffee filled the small living room. On the wall still hung the same photographs she'd grown up with, her mother's smile frozen in a summer long gone, her own face grinning beside a younger version of her father. Amelia had been running from this house, from this quiet, from the truth it held. She unpacked only a small bag and joined her father at the dinner table. The silence between them was deep, but not cold. It was the kind of silence shared by two people who once spoke easily, but had forgotten how. The clinking of forks was the only sound. Thomas finally said, "You look tired." It wasn't a question. Amelia gave a weak smile and said, "I am." He didn't press further, but his eyes seemed to search her face for the story she wasn't telling. Later that evening, she sat on the porch steps with a cup of tea. The air was cool, and the faint smell of rain lingered. She had left Portland for New York 5 years ago, chasing dreams, art school, galleries, independence, and for a while she'd believed she'd made it. She had fallen in love with Daniel, a photographer who made her laugh and promised her a life full of light. But that light had dimmed over time. Their plans turned into arguments, their laughter into silence, until one morning he simply said he couldn't do it anymore. A month later, their wedding invitation still sat in a box under her bed, unopened. That was when she packed her bags and drove home without telling anyone. Thomas came out quietly, his steps measured, his presence steady. He sat beside her without a word. The sound of crickets filled the air, and somewhere far off, a dog barked. The world seemed perfectly ordinary, which made Amelia's heartache feel even heavier. Her father took a slow sip of his coffee, then looked out at the fading light. "You can spend your whole life running," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But if you never stand still, you'll never know where you truly belong." Amelia froze. It was such a simple sentence, yet it felt like the ground shifted beneath her. She looked at him, confused. "I'm not running," she said, though she knew it wasn't true. Her voice was too soft, her eyes too tired to convince anyone, least of all herself. Thomas didn't argue. He just nodded and stared out into the distance, the last bit of daylight painting his face with gold. After he went inside, Amelia stayed on the porch for a long time, listening to the hum of the night. The words "stand still" echoed in her chest. For years, she had chased the idea of success, of love, of proving that she could build a life on her own. But sitting there, she realized she hadn't built anything that felt real. Everything she had been reaching for seemed to vanish the closer she got. Inside, she could hear her father moving about, turning off lights, locking doors, habits that never changed. She thought of how steady he'd always been, how quiet but sure his love had been since her mother passed away. When she left, she told herself he wouldn't miss her, that he was used to being alone. Now, seeing the worn edges of his life, she realized how much he must have missed her in silence. She went to bed early, lying awake in her childhood room. The walls were still painted the same soft yellow. The bookshelf still held her old sketchbooks, the corners curled, the pages filled with dreams that once felt endless. She reached for one and flipped through it under the dim bedside lamp. There were drawings of people she'd met, cities she'd imagined, and one unfinished portrait of her father. She had started it before she left, but never finished. His eyes in the sketch looked younger, full of unspoken pride. Now she couldn't help but wonder what those eyes saw in her tonight. Sleep wouldn't come. Her father's words kept playing in her head. If you never stand still, you'll never know where you truly belong. What did he mean? That she belonged here, back in this quiet town she once couldn't wait to leave? Or that she needed to stop searching for love in places that weren't meant for her? In the morning, she stepped outside just as the sun began to rise. The grass sparkled with dew, and the air smelled like earth and new beginnings. She could see her father by the barn, fixing the same fence that had been falling apart for years. His movements were slow but sure, the same rhythm he'd always had. For the first time, Amelia noticed how peaceful he looked. She realized that all her life she had mistaken stillness for stagnation. But her father wasn't stuck. He was grounded. He wasn't running from pain or chasing happiness. He was simply living it. And that was something she had never learned to do. As she stood there watching him, something shifted quietly inside her. The ache of her heartbreak was still there, but it no longer felt like an ending. It felt like space. Space for something new, something real. Her father noticed her watching and smiled faintly, lifting his coffee mug in greeting. She waved back, feeling the smallest spark of peace for the first time in months. She didn't know what would come next, or if she'd ever go back to New York, but for now, she was standing still. And in that stillness, she finally began to breathe again. That night, when the sky turned purple and the crickets began their song, Amelia sat on the porch once more. The same spot, the same stars, the same cup of tea. But this time, it felt different. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was healing. And in that quiet, she understood her father's words not as advice, but as a gift. It wasn't about choosing between leaving or staying. It was about learning to listen, to her heart, to her roots, and to the voice of the man who had always believed she would find her way back. She looked toward the house where the warm light glowed softly through the window and whispered to herself, "Maybe this is where it begins again."